Hello and welcome from San Francisco to the virtual audience. We're joining here from the AI Governance Summit, and I'm joined by Justine Gauthier and Simon Chesterman. And we will be speaking about how we can harness AI to build resilience and innovation. I'm Michael Jacobides, Sir Donald Gordon Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the London Business School. So I start with a few framing thoughts in terms of where we are and how AI is affecting the reality from firms in all manner of sectors. Most of you will have had the opportunity to play with Gen AI, but Gen AI has only now started to slowly enter the fabric of organizations. Why? Well, because organizations are only now starting to move from it as a productivity tool to something that is truly going to change their business models. People are starting to think about it as something that will be able to substitute for more expensive labor. You can use Gen AI rather than using employees, but that's only the first stage. This is the substitution of capital with labor. We're now starting to think about how we can complement labor and how we can use AI to augment what we're doing. And as we do so, we realize that AI can be used to revolutionize what we do. In what ways? Well, first, it may be important because it can change your entire business model. It can allow you to reconsider the ways in which you add value. Let me give you the example from the institution where I work, London Business School, where AI is not only important because it changes what students do and as such how you can assess them, it changes what you can expect that professors can do in order to drive business insights. But it also starts begging the answer to these deeper questions of what is it that you can do given that AI is out there in building skills that will be useful so that you can be a better business school than others. In addition to that, not only do you need to rethink your business model, you need to think the existential questions, the questions about what is the value add that you are providing. So what is the value add of a certificator? A school like a top business school like ours has the role of offering certification. And in a world of AI, what is it that companies will look for as they consider the skills that have been rendered valuable or less valuable as a result of this new technology? Here we have been speaking about what we need to do in terms of the technology that AI, and in particular generative AI, this new version of AI that has taken the world by storm. And we are trying to consider how we will create the framework in seeing how we can use it to help improve both what organizations do and what society in all and in the aggregate is going to be able to achieve with it. So I will turn to our guests to ask them a few questions in terms of where they see the action being, and then we'll consider how organizations can change their value add in order to harness this new technology. So Justine, let me start with you and let me ask you, you see organizations that are trying to leverage AI, not only generative AI, but AI as big data, what we used to know AI for up until a year ago. What is it that you see them both most excited with, and what do they try to do, and where do they stumble as they look at this new technology to promote innovation and new ways of adding value?
Yeah, so I think especially in the past year, it's really a great moment right now for organizations to be kind of jumping in and harnessing all the opportunities that AI presents for a couple reasons. So the first one is that the barrier to entry for a lot of AI systems, especially when we're talking about generative AI, is lowering. So we have widely available AI systems that are available either through things like APIs or open source that also can be applied to a variety of different uses. So we're seeing organizations have the opportunity to harness those widely available AI systems and using them for their specific use cases. So that's one of the main things that we're seeing. And on the technical side, AI is also going through somewhat of a democratization because before, a few years ago, for specific AI projects, you would need an entire team of machine learning PhDs that will work for months on building a project. And that still is the case for certain use cases. But in a lot of ways now, with some of the more recent technology, those projects can be done by maybe engineers and over the course of a few weeks versus the course of a few months. There are also some challenges right now for organizations. It's really a great moment for big organizations and also smaller companies to be really adopting AI and implementing it into their tech stack. But as we've seen, especially in the past year, AI really taking the world over by a storm, there also has been a rise in all of the different risks on the legal and ethical side. So companies also have to keep that in mind while they're implementing AI and kind of riding that wave right now. So there's a lot of unanswered questions right now around things like intellectual property, privacy, liability. There's a lot of upcoming regulation that's being worked that is not currently enforced yet, but how are companies big and small going to adapt to when that regulation comes into play? I do think that there is a momentum right now, both in AI and in responsible AI. So the companies that are going to be leveraging the momentum, not only of the technology, but also all of the great work and resources that are available for companies to build and adopt AI in a responsible and ethical way, are going to be the organizations that are going to come out on top.
So what we're seeing is a significant reductions of the barriers to entry. And if you see how the technology itself is evolving, certainly on the generative side, it is as user-friendly as it can be. But at the same time, we see the issues around ethics, regulation, and intellectual property that are some of the key open considerations. And Simon, we're going to go to the sort of stuff that you spend your time with. And these types of considerations are considerations that relate to what rules are set by governments. If you think about the governments and the parts of the government that you engage and advise in thinking about how they can create the context so that organizations can take advantage of the opportunities, especially now with the lowering of these costs. What are the key considerations, and how do government actors think about facilitating not only the AI in terms of adoption, but also ensuring that we don't see the downsides by the dark side of AI that we will touch on in a few minutes?
Yeah, and I think you've really put your finger on the challenge for governments is how to avoid under-regulating and how to avoid over-regulating. Under-regulate and you expose your citizens to risk. This is the downside of the democratization, that people have access to all of this power. Over-regulate and you risk driving innovation elsewhere. And I think that's particularly acute for a small economy like Singapore, which is often a rule taker rather than a rule maker. But looking around the world, there are kind of three basic models of governance that we've seen dominating in one sense. And that's the kind of US free market model, which is either driven by free market ideology or the dysfunction of the US political system, whichever you choose, but minimal regulation, and that's arguably really facilitated huge economic activity and a lot of enterprise and a lot of innovation. You've got at the other end the kind of European model, which is really willing to take a hit economically in exchange for promoting a certain rights-based approach that privileges certain rights. And if that means that European citizens don't get access to threads, well, they're prepared to bear that sacrifice. A much smaller jurisdiction like Singapore wouldn't just mean, if it overregulated, wouldn't just mean that threads wasn't rolled out, it might mean that a company moves elsewhere. A third model is the Chinese model, which I think is often understudied in this environment. Until a couple of years ago, I would have said that the Chinese model was very much national security and state sovereignty based. And to some extent it still is. But there's been a lot of interesting experimentation in China, sometimes with a view to protecting the interests of the Communist Party, but also to promote certain values and requiring, for example, truth in some of the large language models, alignment with socialist values, whatever that means. It's not always well defined. And I think that points to one of the really underlying questions that every jurisdiction is going to confront, which is why we regulate. And often in discussions of AI, it's very vague in terms of what we mean by AI, but often vague also in the reasons why we regulate. And we regulate basically for one of two reasons. We regulate to address market failures. If costs, if risks are going to be borne by people who are not in a position to bear them, that's often going to be inefficient. And that's why we saw through the 20th century the emergence of product liability as a regime that puts the onus away from consumers and onto manufacturers. The second reason we regulate is to promote social or other values that we hold dear. The reason we prohibit discrimination is not because it's inefficient, but because it's immoral. And I think every jurisdiction around the world is trying to grapple with these questions so that they don't miss out on the benefits of AI that I think Justine was rightly highlighting, but nor do they expose themselves to risk. And the real challenge is coordination at the international level so that we avoid either a race to the bottom or a bifurcation or a fracturing of the legal system that leads to harmful fragmentation and experimentation that leads to bad results rather than good ones.
Lots of interesting things. I'll just, referring back to what you were saying, 2 years ago, we published a study with some colleagues from the Henderson Institute in BCG, where I'm an academic advisor, where we were looking at the evolution of the AI ecosystems. At the time, nobody was speaking about the generative AI, so we're speaking about the old-style AI ecosystems. And what we found is precisely this trichotomy in terms of the jurisdictions with an extra twist, and that was that if you look at the Chinese model, it also has a much more active role for the state in coordinating economic actors. Alibaba training smaller organizations in China to make them more AI friendly, which then takes me to some other considerations that jurisdictions or governments may have in terms of thinking about either how they promote technologies, and the Chinese example is a very interesting one where we have seen a proactive support for a number of reasons of AI, even before generative AI came into play. At the same time, and I think that there's a common misperception, that they have regulated probably more than almost any other jurisdiction. If you look at the regulation of AI that was issued a few months ago, the Chinese regulation is probably stronger and has much more by way of teeth than the regulations even of the EU, and certainly the US, which is more support the development of the local ecosystem. That, though, brings me to another interesting topic in terms of AI, and it is the fact that if you look at AI, what we knew from non-generative AI, because generative AI is in front of us and we haven't seen its impact yet, is that it increases the inequality of profit distribution between firms. First of all, those that have a more digital DNA are able to integrate AI because they are able to take all these little modular pieces that AI brings and as such gain productivity. And second is that we see an increase in terms of the heterogeneity of performance of the strong firms and of the weaker firms. Now, generative AI is an interesting new kind of animal, and does strange things. It does things like, well, if you think about the use of it, it increases productivity, but it also helps the laggards rather than the ones that are doing their job too well, which leads to interesting questions of how do you manage your workforce? It also sometimes gives the possibility of people being confused on whether they are using it for a good effect or not. In a recent study that was out in terms of the productivity impact of AI, we saw that AI that is used to do new creative stuff, ChatGPT in particular, well, you can be much more creative in doing slides for a consulting presentation or come up with new ideas. But if you answer a real business problem that has an answer, people fell for the wrong answer that ChatGPT gave because it didn't understand the situation too well, which takes us to an interesting new set of issues. Not only will we see a heterogeneity in terms of performance with those that are able to use it vastly outperforming the others, there's also a bit of an uncertainty of where you should use it and where not, which means you shouldn't have an autopilot. But let's now move to using more of it if it increases productivity and if it helps you be more effective. So if you think about where organizations go to think about it, they can go to industry conference, but people there don't really understand AI. They usually go to those that are at the cutting edge, and academics now are in the forefront, and there is a new excitement in terms of the collaboration between academia and business. Since this is the world that you inhabit, tell us a little bit about how is it that you see the collaboration between the firms that are interested to look at AI and those who are producing it in the cutting edge of academia. Justine.
Yeah, so one of the things that we do at Mila is collaborating with industry, so bigger firms and smaller firms on both fundamental AI research through our academic research lab, and also applied research for a bit more concrete use cases with certain organizations. And as the field and the technology is evolving, especially over the past year, we have seen that the opportunities for collaboration between industry and academia are also evolving. Of course, we still have a lot of really deep and rich collaborations with bigger tech companies where our researchers will work on really fundamental, advanced machine learning problems with their counterparts, so machine learning experts that are already housed within certain corporations. But what we're also starting to see is a lot of interest that was already existing before, but that has kind of been accelerated in collaboration between industry and academia in a multidisciplinary manner. And what I mean by that is a couple of things. First of all, we see a lot of what we tend to call AI for science. So for example, at Mila, we have a lot of research collaborations with pharmaceutical companies where we are working with these companies on drug discovery applications of AI. We're also working with companies in climate tech on how to help them use AI to improve their product and their tech stack. And I mean, I also really see now with the whole AI governance world really accelerating opportunities to collaborate with academia on the soft sciences side. So things like ethical AI, responsible AI, law, philosophy. So we're also starting to see interest from organizations in collaborating with academia in different ways now, and not just on the pure technical way.
Okay, so you told us why there is excitement, and I can certainly see the many different ways in which excitement could manifest itself. But the other part of what it is that you're doing is to iron out the difficulties. So let's now go and consider a little bit, what are the challenges as you see organizations that are trying to access this knowledge and see how they can integrate it?
Yeah, I mean, on the technical side, as I said previously, the barrier to entry is lowering in certain ways. So I think, on the technical side, there is a lot of opportunities for organizations to educate their employees more on that side, and they don't have necessarily to get the same level of expertise that they needed to. Now, on more of the risks and challenges and AI governance side, there is so many resources that are available right now. This is a field that is really evolving. So we're seeing, depending on the types of companies, it can start with something as small as just having an internal policy for employee use of generative AI, going back to what you were saying before. What do we want to use it for? What don't we want to use it for? What are the use cases that are relevant for our firm, our organization? And then it can go as far as implementing, frameworks such as the NIST framework for companies that are actually developing AI. So it really depends on the types of needs of each individual firm, obviously. And academia is certainly a sector where we can have collaboration in that manner, but I also think there is a lot of public, private, multi-stakeholder organizations and forums where firms can really gain a lot of knowledge into how to implement AI, but how to do it in a responsible way.
Which then, again, brings us to the question of what is the value add of different institutions, and what we were discussing earlier, these deeper existential questions, which then may need to have us reconsider how we run our own organizations, whether they are for profits or whether they exist in the non-for-profit sector. But now let me turn to a slightly different set of questions, because this is almost the nice part of AI, but there is also the stark reality that AI leads to a substitution of capital with labor. And you can say, in the long run, it'll all work out. But then again, the long run is usually decades away. And the last time we had such large-scale industrial substitution, there were significant riots, and now we also have political dynamics that can make this a really explosive mix. Let's now think about it again from the perspective of a state, because if you think about it, and Simon, I'll ask you again to put your cap on someone who thinks about it from the perspective of an advisor to what a government does, and then say, how is it that we expect that AI will affect the economy, not just by offering individual opportunities for people who are setting up companies, but by thinking about the broader needs that it can serve, but also the ways that it can disrupt not only firms, but also people working within them. What do you think the impact may be, and do we see any patterns emerging on what appears to be more or less safe from this significant change that we have coming upon us?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge and difficult question. I mean, I think in these conversations, often we focus either on the sort of long-term existential risk type question, and I think it was Keynes who said in the long run we're all dead.
Absolutely.
Or we're focused much more immediately on the sort of the discrimination, the bias, the hallucinations. I do think there are medium-term risks, which are what this is going to mean for whole economies, what it's going to mean for societies. And there are a couple of ways of thinking about this. You can think of it at least in terms of the economic, the political, and the social. The economic effect is what's it going to mean when the tax base, which in many jurisdictions is based on human labor, is outsourced. If a lot of that human labor disappears, and a lot of the economic value actually is being created by algorithms within companies, and those algorithms are controlled by multinational corporations based elsewhere. That's going to lead to tax problems in many jurisdictions, and so I think we'll eventually need to have some kind of movement on that. The recent agreement on 15% minimum corporate tax rate maybe is a good start. But politically, what's it going to mean if you have huge numbers of people whose jobs have been broken down into tasks? Initially, that'll be very convenient for organizations, which, as we've been saying, will be able to save money, optimize resources. But I think initially many people will think this is a great tool that'll free up some of my time. The question is whether your employer is going to pay you for that extra time. If 40% of your job is drudgery that AI can do, what makes you think that your employer is going to pay you when the AI is doing that? And that leads to the sort of third area, the social disruption, which is what it's going to mean for human meaning. A lot of us find significant meaning in our work. And if a lot of that work disappears, if everyone becomes a gig worker, what's that going to mean for human fulfillment? And I think this is one of the real challenges. I mean, we've been talking about the role of academia, but actually in many ways, one of the biggest transformations over the last decade is the move of fundamental research in AI from academia to private organizations. That's partly because of the capital costs associated with large language models, but also just the difficulty of retaining talent. And so what that's meant is that these unknown unknowns are extrapolating, partly because they're just inherently difficult, but also because the speed with which we go from basic idea in pure research to deployment to application is being reduced. So we're racing at speed into these many unknowns, and how do governments respond? Well, the starting point is to educate the population. That's certainly something we're really focused on in Singapore. The idea that you can sort of put this genie back in the lantern, I think, is a non-starter. And so you've got to educate people, you've got to prepare them. But educating them is difficult. The kind of economic disruptions of the first, second, third industrial revolutions, yes, there were protests, yes, there were Luddites and so on who were focused on a political as much as an economic program, but you could retrain people. The challenge now is the kind of people who are going to need retraining are significantly older, and the challenge of retraining them, the skills that they're going to need are much harder. Although the irony is, in many ways in the past, it was the kind of, if you like, the lower end of the economy that lost their jobs. Now it's going to be the middle sector. It's going to be those people with a college degree, basic university degree, because anything that's cognitive, repetitive, and reasonably low risk, these are the things that companies are going to want to outsource. And that's where a good chunk of the middle class currently find their employment. And if that disappears, you have this combination of economic, political, and indeed social challenges.
Well, and just to be a little bit cheeky, the Luddites were not voters when these revolutions happened. Right now, everyone votes, and if you think about political dynamics, it is the disaffection with the fact that people feel they're not as well off that has stroked the populism that has started destabilizing governments all over the world. So unfortunately, in that regard, we do have a serious issue at the same time that the climate emergency is going to start posing yet another set of problems that we're not well equipped to address. But let me focus on what you were saying in terms of the not short term, not the immediate term, not the here's a nice way of using ChatGPT as my personal assistant, or let me make sure that the way that we use it is not a problem with regards to our company policy or IP, or not think about whether robots are going to kill us. And I agree that the core of the issues, and the issues that we're not really speaking about yet, is what you mentioned there in terms of the medium term. I don't even know whether it is a question of medium term. I think that these are the real issues of rethinking how we structure our organizations and how we ensure that they are fit for purpose so that we can enhance resilience rather than developing a brittle world. Now, if we think about that small follow-up question, where do you see in terms of the areas that may be challenged, perhaps professions, perhaps types of firms that will be most challenged? How would you characterize the areas that, if you take the broad level, you would see most challenges emerge?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I'd like to flip the question on its head and say which areas won't be challenged. And I think that really is going to be the question for many organizations. And I can tell you, my students, their nightmare question when they're being interviewed is, so what can you do that ChatGPT can't? And so that's already an issue. So, okay, so let's flip that on and say, what are the kind of careers, what are the kind of jobs that are not going to be threatened? And basically, they would fall into three categories. First, there are the things that are really, really hard to automate. So things like construction, certain forms of manual labor is actually quite complex to automate, so those jobs will be reasonably safe, at least construction, some areas like that. Secondly, there are areas where we as societies really want humans in certain roles. So healthcare, certain forms of education, at least primary, secondary. I think for this panel, we're hoping tertiary, at least for a while. So there are roles where we really want humans for the kind of emotional side of things that, at least at the moment, AI can't really make up for. And the third, and this in many ways will be the most interesting, is going to be the industries that will fight. The industries with some measure of political power. So the legal profession, I can tell you, will fight, not to preserve all of the jobs, that's clearly not going to happen, but they will fight to preserve it as a regulated profession. They've been very good at negotiating free trade agreements that cover everything except legal services, and I think that will continue into the near future. But even within law firms, even in big organized, formally guilds, you're already seeing a kind of structural challenge that suggests there's a ticking time clock on this, because they're willing to outsource junior work as long as they preserve the senior work. The question then, of course, is if you still need senior accountants, senior lawyers, and so on, where are they going to come from if you don't have a stable of juniors? And so I think that's going to become a question that many of these industries are going to have to confront. Even as they reap the enormous benefits of AI, they're going to have to think longer term about the sustainability of those industries if they're not going to be disrupted out of existence.
Absolutely, and that takes us to what is it that will allow for some organizations and some professions to keep their privileges. Lawyers have the extra advantage of legislating, so they tend to be in a relatively good sword when such issues come up. But what this, I think, is going to remind us is that things that perhaps we had not understood the business significance of, which are regulations with a capital letter R and a lower case letter R, are going to be very important because they affect what you are able to do and what you're not able to do. Decisions of life and death, as humans, we don't like to outsource to machines, even if they are better doing it with us, as we have seen with autonomous driving. And a number of the choices that will be made, and will be made through regulation, which is all of a sudden starting to become much more strategic than it was. We have seen that with the emergence of big tech and with the way in which the boundaries are being negotiated between what big tech firms and between what firms in other existing sectors are doing. So we're speaking about how AI is not only going to allow for innovations to happen, but how AI is going to reshape the industrial landscape. And rather than thinking about it in terms of short-term, medium-term, and long-term, it's probably best to think that there are some things that are priorities about today, but some things that you need to build as you're thinking about either your overall business model or purpose, if you're not there in order to drive money, and something that really affects your existential license of the fact that you need to be seen to add value in a world of AI. And how you translate that into priorities is going to be what will probably affect who's going to be successful and who not, in terms of organizations, but also in terms of nation states. Much more to speak about and lots of multi-stakeholder discussions. So the World Economic Forum is clearly well positioned to host them. Let me thank you again for a fascinating conversation. And we will be returning back to the AI Governance Summit. Thank you so much for all of you for watching us virtually. Goodbye.